Right, we're on.
Welcome to what I think is the 20th Aginext event and the first day of psychological safety that we've had. So we're really excited to have everyone here. For those that don't know, Aginext is a community and hopefully safe space to experiment around all things agile, future of work, God forbid, happiness at work. The sundry events of the last year and a half made us realize that the lack of psychological safety in our work lives and our lives in general, hence a whole day dedicated to organizational psychological safety and inclusion. And since I helped plan the conference, I got the privilege to appoint myself host of a panel and pick some of my favorite people in tech to talk about one of my favorite topics in tech. So here we are. This panel is going to talk about how to apply the routines and rituals that we have in the agile space or in technology in general on our teams with consideration. If we're building the future, what kind of future are we actually building? If we are constantly focused on failing fast and releasing faster and faster, when are we taking pause to think about the effects of what we're building? What happens when mostly white males and usually under 50 are building and training the robot overlords that will soon be rising above us? What will those robot overlords think and consider? Can tech actually be made by everyone and for everyone if everyone is moving towards everyone is a consumer of tech? Or do they have to be? So yeah, it's going to be a really light conversation, really obvious problems to solve. And this is actually the only one shared with the outside world. So if you are streaming with us live, thank you. Please share it, like it if you'd like it. And of course, those that are at the conference on Zoom, please do make my life easier by providing your questions in the chat, and I will filter them into that. There went my pen. And now let's meet our lovely panelists. Please introduce yourself, a bit about your background and what you define as agile. Anne, do you want to start?
Oh, right. So I've been in the tech industry my name is Anne Currie. I've been in the tech industry for just over 25 years now. And I was an engineer, and then I was a manager, and then I did startups. And these days I do a lot of writing about tech, and I'm also a lecturer in tech ethics at the University of Hertfordshire. And I'm a science fiction writer these days as well. I'm just finished the second draft of my 6th science fiction novel. So yeah, for me, I have to admit, because I'm quite old, I'm probably the oldest person. Actually, I'm by far the oldest person on this panel. And so the vast majority of the time I worked in engineering as an actual engineer, we were doing Waterfall, not agile. So agile a little bit when in the early days of agile, right at the end of when I was actively typing away at a computer. And I have to say there are pros and cons. So most of my career was in Waterfall rather than agile. One of the things in Waterfall is it's very slow. You have loads of time to think about what you're doing. You have months and years before the product hits the field in which to think through all your issues. So with agile, it's rather different. You get stuff out there very quickly. It's fast, it's quick. And I think we sometimes underestimate the value of thinking and planning and being a little bit more concerned about things like the environmental impact of what we're doing and how efficient it is. So that's my perspective.
Awesome. Paul, how about you go next to introduce yourself and tell us what you think agile is? Or what ethics is, sorry.
You want me to talk about the ethics of it? Okay. So I am Paul Johnston. I am I have various roles. I've been in tech for over 20 years, so pre-agile as well. So not quite as old as Anne, although she is far better. She is far better at everything than I am. I started off coding, moved into management over time, have done a whole range of roles within tech, and have done interim CTO work, and have moved into various roles which have included ethics and ethics research as well, alongside Caitlin, in fact, who will talk later, I'm sure. And I talk about climate change a lot. So you may have seen me talk about that a little somewhere along the line. Do you want me to talk about the is agile ethical yet?
No, we'll get to that when we get
to
what is ethics? Like, in a couple words, how would you define ethics?
What is ethics? So ethics is the framework around which you make your decisions. And so, you know, in the simplest possible sense, it's like, how do I come to a decision at this point around, you know, how do I do something right now? What is the underpinning around this decision? And societally, we have a whole bunch of values that we hold, and we make decisions based on that. And within a company, there are values that we hold, and we make decisions around that. And those things are often in conflict, but they can often be relatively straightforward. And we always think that actually we know what the ethics should be, but actually it's a lot more complicated than that often. And we sit within our bubbles and often think that everybody else thinks like we do, and that's just not true.
No, everyone does not think like we do. Even in this room, while we have some similar mindsets, I think we all think very differently too. Sam, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and what you think ethics is?
Happy to. I'm not going to compete with Anne and Paul's a number of years of experience, but I think I'm probably a bit more of a wanderer between worlds. So my career has been extremely varied. Someone described themselves as an aggressive generalist recently, and I'm going to absolutely nick that term. I've worked in a number of sectors, from early childhood education to financial technology. But most recently, I was working at .everyone, which is a responsible technology think tank, thinking about the impact of technology on society. And I am now co-founder of a social innovation practice called Consequential. We specialize in responsible strategy, culture, and change within technology-enabled companies. And I mean, Paul did a fairly good job of summarizing ethics. And to be honest, I don't really talk about ethics so much as I talk about responsible innovation. And I think we boil responsible innovation down to being open and accountable with your intent, being aware of the potential consequences of your business decisions and taking steps to address them, and being thoughtful and inclusive about who is involved in the innovation process.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is ethics is unto itself a controversial term, or overwhelming term to a lot of people. Kingsley, can you introduce yourself a bit and tell us what you think ethics is?
Hey, sure, no problem. Thanks, Jen. Okay, so my name's Kingsley Davies. I'm a partner at a consulting company called Consulting, who do things around functional programming, architecture, design, delivery. We also have tried to promote an event over recent years called Scala Bridge, which is intended to do free training and increase diversity and inclusivity into the functional kind of programming domain. Over several years, probably over about the past decade, one way or another, been involved in either setting up or organising conferences, typically around functional programming or operations. About 5 years ago, got involved in doing stuff around kind of the blockchain space as well, really just because I was intrigued around what was going on there. But as a segue from that, I ended up partly inspired by some work that Anne was doing as well at the time in setting up a conference around good technology. So I did the Good Tech Conf about 3 years ago, which a few others on the panel here were speakers at, and I was very pleased about that too. But really, it was a bit of a discovery process to find out, where are we in technology? What does ethics mean in technology? It was a bit of a recce into that area, to be honest with you. Most recent work I've been doing is government support work for COVID schemes and around identity. So that kind of brings things a bit up to date. In terms of where do ethics sit with Agile, that's a great question. And I think one that Paul did a great start of answering too. I think it really, ethics define the boundaries of intent on the software that we're trying to deliver. So what's the intended consequences of that technology? How far in the future can we try and shape that technology so that it can be used for positive ends too? And what are the measures that we can apply as we're doing agile delivery? So agile delivery having lots of checks and balances and measures of observability through the delivery pipeline. what are the checks and balances and measures of observability that we've got around ethics? And I think this is where we start to see increasingly more frameworks emerge to try and measure ethics within a given context of either business or technology. But I'm intrigued to see kind of what others are up to in terms of being able to measure their ethical impact and ethical intent and direction too. So anyway, that's some of my background. Thanks again for starting this out too, Jen. It's really great and useful.
Yeah, and this is a great transition, especially when we talk about frameworks, to our digital anthropologist, Caitlin.
Hi, everyone. Really great to be here, especially with such distinguished minds. And I work for a technology consultancy and research company. We advise lots of large businesses on various things, but in my case, a lot of it is around digital ethics. I also do some work on the future of work and what does it mean that we live in an increasingly distributed working world, which of course, as you can imagine with the pandemic, suddenly became very popular. And Paul and I have done some work together on sustainability become increasingly important to the strategic center, which I view as very, very related to digital ethics more broadly. And to that point, I think that when we talk about ethics in the context of digital technologies, what we're really talking about is a collective shared understanding of what the right thing to do is. And I think there are parts of that that are important, one of them being what we do, because there are a lot of moral things that you can think around beliefs, but actually ethics is more around guiding action, specifically guiding action. And of course, ethicists have been arguing about what the right thing to do is for thousands and thousands of years, and many, many different cultures approach it in many different ways. And even within Western culture alone, most of the kind of language that we have around ethics comes from the Greek. So there are several different viewpoints around what are the specific ways that you can think about what the right thing to do is. But even those frameworks are often quite narrow-minded if you don't consider the rest of the world and other ways that digital, that ethical frameworks have evolved. So I think there's a piece here around opening up the conversation to ensuring that we really are being inclusive when we think about ethics as well.
And what we build, thinking about what we build, collective shared understanding of what is the right thing to do, which I think unto itself makes ethics highly controversial, which is great for me. So I heard decision frameworks, responsible innovation, consequences, defining boundaries of intent, checks and balances. Which brings me to the opposite. And Paul, because you definitely brought it up cheekily in our little DMs on Twitter, but our community is rooted in agile. So I want to quote the first of the 12 agile principles, those are the most important. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So we're about 20 years into this, a little longer, this thing called agile. Is that the right goal for those of us that are building the future? And is agile ethical inherently or not?
So, yeah, it's a really great question. It's a really difficult question to answer. And I think, ethics is it's exactly around the values that we live by and that define our actions. And so you can and Caitlin is exactly right. We have different ethics depending on the situation that we're in. Different ethics at work and different ethics at home, and different ethics define what we do in the different places that we are. And society will have different ethics to when you're at work as well. So when we are discussing what ethics are, it's the values that we are living by at that particular moment or at that particular time. And I think we have a very Western view, certainly in the tech world, we have a very Western view of what ethics should be in tech. And so I think if you look at agile, I think you can see libertarian values coming through. I think you can see the philosophy of the customer is the highest priority. You can see that, it's all about prioritizing them and making sure that we're doing the best for them, and, making sure that we do it as quickly as possible and in the best way, and making sure that that's at the forefront. And the Agile Manifesto, if you have a look at it, is intentionally almost codifying those priorities for people that follow it. And so, yes, you can kind of see that ethically what it's trying to do is set up a situation where It's saying, you know, you should, here's your way of making decisions. You know, in this situation, you know, if the customer comes along and says you need to change this, it's a really good process for changing and making decisions. So in some ways, in terms of the ethical, in terms of the agile world, in the context of what you're doing, it's ethical. But I put that in quotes, important, because I think if you look at it from the context of society, I think you would have a very strong case for saying that societally, you would have a problem with agile. So if you step back a little bit, and I think this makes me quite nervous, is that it actually puts the customer at the top. So if the highest priority is the customer, then if the customer isn't societally ethical in whatever way that is, maybe you are a person who thinks that gambling is wrong, and it's a gambling customer, and they're asking you for all of these changes and all of these things, and they're trying to, you know, track their users and make them spend more money. Then maybe that is societally unethical, but, you know, agilely ethical. So which is it? What are you doing? How are you defining ethics at that point? So at best, it's a tool to allow a customer to create unethical products in a sense. Allow a person to create unethical products for a customer with limited oversight. And I think that's the point here, is that actually, where is the oversight? How do you use it? And what are the, how do you add in responsibility? And I think if you don't have that step of responsibility and understanding within that wider context of society, and where the company fits in society, I think you would have a real problem making the case that agile, the way that you are using agile is ethical within the context of society. But I think within the context of itself, I think it's actually relatively ethical within that context. Does that make sense?
Sam, you are jumping. Go. Yeah. She's like,
no, I think Paul makes an absolutely excellent distinction, you know, between what is the ethics in the moment and the context of how you are operating. The reason I'm jumping is I actually gave a talk about this at Metro's Agile conference last year. What are the future values of ethics? And me and my co-founder really started to bounce around, you know, if this is the inherent framework and structure that you are operating within, and that it defines the bounds of ethics in tech, then what should those values now be for the future? Because, you know, as you said, Jen, this is a 20-year-old framework. And one of the things that I actually quite like about the Agile Manifesto originally is that it's inherently addressing problems that they felt existed in tech at the time, and then layering values over top of that. And so I think ultimately what we kind of came up with around what those values could be was actually shifting to being stakeholder conscious over customer centric, and focusing on objectives over measuring outputs, foresight over failing fast, collective responsibility over disjointed disempowerment, and critical questioning over rigid rituals. And I think a lot of those touch on some of the issues that you're seeing in Agile right now that are blocking more ethical considerations of society as a whole in the software development process.
completely agree with that. Yeah, and if we're putting the customer first, then we're just going very under that ideology that the customer is always right, when that's impossible if everyone's a customer. Yeah, and if you take that position, you're essentially removing yourself from responsibility. You are essentially saying that they have to be right, and it's not my responsibility. And I think that Anne can talk to this very much. That is stepping away and saying, this isn't my fault. If something is unethical, this isn't my fault. And I think that is the very worst take on software, but it's what we've essentially created.
I mean, the Agile Manifesto in and of itself isn't the whole story when you're writing code anyway. Even if you're following that, what about the law? What if your users want something that's against the law? Well, you're putting another framework in front of your decision making. At some point, you have to decide, well, I'm not going to do that because it's against the law. So you already are putting in more into the mix than just what your customers want. So, and your customers don't reflect all of humanity, probably, unless you're extremely successful. So, and even if you are, like Facebook, it still doesn't always work out because you might not be actually taking into account the needs of all of those users. So, yeah, this goes to something that Everyone used to talk about a great deal, which is, you know, who is it benefiting? Which of your customers is benefiting? Who are your customers? How do they reflect everybody who's going to be who's going to use your product will be affected by it?
Yeah, and just jumping on exactly what Anne says, because I talked about this a lot, but you know, that difference between stakeholders and customers to me, I think is so key, because your customer might be the person who's downloading your app and using it, but there's so many other people in that customer's lives who might be impacted by their use of that technology that you should equally be thinking about and designing for. And just really expanding your understanding of who's going to be interested in or impacted by your technology. And that's everyone that you need to be considering, not only the person who's downloading it off of the stores. Like, just so critical to actually designing technology for everyone.
Yeah, someone from our audience actually shared a TED talk about how drug cartels are very good at agile. So there's that. I have to ask Anne, because you have the reflection of both waterfall and agility. Agility is very much about moving fast, failing fast, while waterfall is following a plan. Do you think there were more ethical considerations during waterfall?
I said there could have been. Were there? No. It was a different time when we talked about these things a lot less. But usually the products had less impact than they do now. There is one way where I think that agile has the capacity, and probably does generally, it is generally more likely to be morally good than waterfall, which is that, well, something we haven't talked about at all is beyond thinking. So obviously you want to get things right up front and think through them and try and avoid doing terrible things, but you will still do terrible things because you never think out all bugs. But you need to monitor in the field so that when terrible things do happen, you see it and you stop it and you resolve it. And you're more likely to do that, I think, with agile, because agile is used to doing a lot of field monitoring. Waterfall could always be a bit fire and forget because you were sick of it by the time it launched and nobody wants to ever look at the damn thing again. But agile, you have to keep talking to the customers all the time. And that's a good thing, because you'll do terrible things, but if you spot it and you fix it really fast, then there's a limit to how much damage you can do. And that's something we haven't talked about. Monitoring is utterly key to doing the right thing.
I'd probably follow on from that to say, I mean, ethically and following the Agile Manifesto, I mean, delivering working software feels like that's an ethical must for a customer anyway. Having short batch sizes, short cycle times, and having lots of communication with the customer feels like the ethically correct way to deliver software. Whether that software and the impact of it is actually ethical in itself, I guess partly that depends on who your customer is, who the end client is. Are you building software that is tech for good software? Are you building software that's for a very specific audience, which might have very different priorities than a tech for good piece of software in itself? I think typically though, does Agile lend itself better to short cycle times, shorter interaction moments, and abilities to measure things and pivot quickly if things feel like they're going off track? I suspect so. I'm really intrigued to know kind of more about what Caitlin's got to say about how some of those things could be measured at those short gaps between cycle times too. And yeah, so part of me wonders too, and this isn't a loaded question, but whether people ever actually do measurement of how agile they are or agile matriculation unless they feel like they're not acting in an agile way. Similarly, in the ethical kind of camp, do people ever try to actually measure how ethical their software and delivery is unless they feel like they're acting in an unethical way? I don't know. I don't know if it's a thing that those checkpoints and measures only come to the fore when you feel like you're kind of swimming against the tide. But yeah, I'm intrigued to kind of have Caitlin's opinions on it.
Several things to pick up on there. To answer that last point first, Kingsley, I think people also will try to measure things when they want a reputational benefit as well. So they aren't just necessarily looking at risk, but they might also be trying to say, look how great we are. And you can see that through, if you look beyond the specific digital ethics things, if you think about something like the growth of, for example, fair trade being a desirable thing from a consumer perspective, you can actually compare that now to increasing kind of green credibility and credentials, and perhaps you can start to see some of these kind of kite marks emerging for ethical products that have not biased against anyone, which I think is a good thing, but also you then run into the risk of that just being reputational rather than actually having an impact. And that question around measurement, and I think we've kind of gotten into this, is fast or slow ethically inherently better or worse? And I actually think a lot of the work that I do is actually about resolving those concerns and saying that there's no time at which you shouldn't have some kind of ethical framework available to you, no matter how fast you're moving. And actually, Natalie Banner of the Wellcome Patient Data and Research Unit said something that I thought was really profound at an event I saw her speak at. And it was the reason that we can really drive quickly in cars is because they have brakes, right? So you actually wouldn't be able to drive as fast if you didn't have a way of slowing down really quickly. And so I wonder if that's one of the ways of resolving these concerns around waterfall, agile. Oh no, we can't resolve these things.
And I just completely agree with that. And I was just noticing the comment in the chat, which was talking about isn't asking if agile is ethical or unethical, kind of like asking if a hammer is ethical or unethical. And I was like, okay, I know where you're coming from, but why do you make a hammer? You make a hammer to hammer a nail. And it's like, you could also ask, well, what about a gun? You know, why do you make a gun? You make a gun to fire bullets, which is there to, you know, hit things. And then why do you make a nuclear bomb? You know, you make a nuclear, do you see what the point is? That you make a tool for a reason. And agile is a tool. Agile is simply a tool, and the tool is there for a reason. The reason is to make better software, to make better decisions, make better management decisions. It's not inherently anything. It's just a tool, but it will do some things better than others. Like, you wouldn't use a hammer to drive a car. Do you know what I mean? That's my point, is that a hammer is there for a reason. Agile is there for a reason. You will use it. Paul,
it's, as part of the ethical discussion, we also have to recognize that hammers do have the potential to cause harm should someone want to use it in that way, right? Exactly. And so I think some of it is about how do you safeguard and ensure that hammers are used by those who wish to use them in the way that they are intended to be used, for example.
Yeah. And so
for those of us, I'm just going to reset the room for a second before we continue. Thank you, Clubhouse, for teaching us these skill sets. For those of you joining us live, you're with Anne, Paul, Sam, Caitlin, Kingsley, and I at Aginext Day of Psychological Safety. And we are debating agile and ethics and how to move fast without destroying the world, I guess. And just a reminder to those that are saying, well, why do we do things like that? Sometimes people just do things because they can. That's why people climb Mount Everest. And now we know there's drastic ecological issues with that. So it's not if they can do it, if they should do it. So we're in an agile rich community. Nobody likes frameworks like they do. So I have to ask you, Caitlin, from your role, can you give us an overview of some of the frameworks or tools? I guess, is there even, as we go in this world of continuous delivery, are there best practices that you can even automate into this process?
There are so many tools. And in fact, Sam's just done some great work on an overview of what kinds of tools exist for, in particular, data-driven technologies, which is through the Open Data Institute. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that. But there's some broader frameworks as well. And I think from my perspective, there's two really interesting things happening. One is you have the development of tools that are really designed for governance at a kind of institutional or organizational level, some of which are specifically aimed at like senior business leaders who may never touch a line of code ever in their lives, but they need some way of kind of figuring out what's going on and what they're building. And then you have some that are more if you think about like an agile methodology or a process, a lot of it actually is about talking, right? Or sticking sticky notes on things. Those aren't necessarily about actually writing code. Those are about deciding things. And so we have a lot of those which are specifically aimed at technologists, but are not necessarily technology tools. And then you have a third category of things, which is actual libraries of code that you inject into your machine learning workflow, and they do things. Now, I'm not a data scientist, so I haven't used these, but I can tell you a few of them because I knew you were going to ask this question, Jen. So I wrote them down. There's a whole bunch of stuff like DeepLift, which is a Python framework. Google has a whole kind of, I can't read my own writing here, but they've done something called SHAP, Lime, Ellis. There's a thing called Skater, which just immediately makes me think of Avril Lavigne. So there's a whole bunch of stuff out there which is available. And I think the thing that really interests me, because mostly the people that I work with are like senior business stakeholders, is that knowing that those things exist, now what this becomes is essentially a procurement and risk problem. Because they need to trust, because they're never actually going to go and use these things, much like me. So they need to trust that those things work well enough that whatever risks they're trying to manage or whatever benefits they're trying to achieve, because it isn't just about risk management, but also about advancing and making yourself competitively differentiated, that those tools are up to the job, in the same way that if you had a supplier for anything, you would want to know that the things that you're getting them in to supply for you are up to the job as well.
And then how do we measure that?
Yeah, exactly.
How can you say if you...
They probably think that I mean a very specific thing. Whereas if I talk to, a CEO or the marketing department or something like that, and I'm talking about bias, they probably think I mean a really different thing. And so it's really important to get on the same page about what you're trying to achieve, because you might find that you're actually working at cross purposes when you're trying to achieve some of these things. And most of these actually do have mathematical definitions that you can use. And so if you're trying to measure things, they're often doing that. But sometimes that will then miss kind of broader points around fairness or equitability in society that is actually what somebody wants to achieve.
Wow. Sam, do you want to add to that what you've done your research on?
Yeah, and Caitlin did such an amazing little summary of everything that happened there. The research that I did was sort of looking into what these first generation of tech and data ethics tools looked like and what the impact has been, who's adopted them, and what have their motivations been, and what does that all look like, and what maybe is best practice for the next generation of ethics tools. And I think Caitlin's pointing bang on, and here's where we're seeing proliferation of different tools starting to really centralize, and the next step is starting to prove their efficacy. But I'll pick up a little bit on what she was saying and something Kingsley brought up in terms of measurement, in that I think a lot of senior stakeholders and a lot of technologists are really looking for a type of measurement of these ethics process tools that simply doesn't and maybe can't exist. And I find that quite interesting in the context of Agile, because measurement of Agile adoption, to Kingsley's point, is largely process metrics around have you done it or have you not done it? How many teams are doing stand-ups, how many are not? As opposed to what's the impact of Agile on my bottom line? And I find it just really kind of interesting that everyone seems to be, well, how does ethics make me more profitable, when it's kind of, inherently there's an element of ethics which is process oriented as opposed to income oriented. So I think there's just an interesting thing I've noticed that I'll kind of point out there if anyone wants to jump on that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that too. I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head. I suppose part of me also wonders that as part of kind of often in technology training, or when you're first kind of getting into technology as a career, whether we don't emphasize the economics of technology enough and doing kind of any kind of level of cost benefit analysis over the actual kind of observability of the runtime of that technology that you develop. And it's any of the measurable impact that you can get from that working software, which slightly reminds me around some work that both Anne and Paul had done before around measuring hosting providers and the sustainable servers kind of initiative that they were driving as well some time ago, which was comparing different hosting providers and trying to determine what the sustainability of your kind of running infrastructure is as something that's measurable and impactful in terms of actual running software, not just the kind of social impact of that, but the actual economic and environmental impact of that, which I thought was a great initiative that they'd been driving forward too. So I think Paul also wanted to jump in at that point.
I did, and I was letting you finish your point.
I will cheekily post a link to the Sustainable Servers petition too, though.
Thank you. You will hear a bit of a noise in the background, I think, but apologies if my child makes a noise. The point that I wanted to make was around living with uncertainty and living in an uncertain space, because I think what a lot of people in business want is they want certainty. They want a tick list. They want to be able to go da 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 da. I've done all these things, and I am ethical, or I am whatever. And the problem is that actually you can't do that. You just can't live with that in the space of ethics. You actually have to have that framework, and you have to follow your ethics and say, these are the decisions we're going to make, and this is what balances out, this is how we're going to balance out our ideas, so that when we make a decision, we're making it with this basis. And that will lead to ambiguity. And I think we are terrible within the business world at living with ambiguity. We want certainty. We want to know this is the right decision to do with 100%. And I think ethics is this gray area where people just want certainty and they can't have it. And so that's why we end up with all of these frameworks that tell us, this is the right answer. And then everyone goes with that right answer. And actually, within the ethics world, that isn't the right way of approaching things. We should be approaching things with, this is difficult. Let's have a conversation and let's make a decision together, which is understanding our values and then going forwards together, which is very different to tick list and using tech and all of that. And I think we miss that.
I think that kind of connects back to something that Caitlin said at the beginning, that the ethics frameworks, they're all quite limited in a way. They're a step. They're all good at getting you to think about a little bit more than you would do if you weren't looking at an ethics framework, but then none of them cover everything. I mean, they're amazing how many of them are really American-centered, and it's all truth, justice, and the American way. And there are loads of other issues that you want to be thinking about. But if you just look at an ethical framework, it will help you expand the range of the things you're thinking about, but it doesn't take you all the way. So it will be easy to be lulled into a false sense of security, as I think Paul is saying there, really.
And I think, just taking that point, if you look at the idea of freedom of speech, and well, to jump into that whole argument, that is a very different conversation in the US to pretty much everywhere else in the world, but it's held up to being the conversation that is very similar across the entire internet. So therefore, it is the kind of thing we should be talking about in tech. And we have a real problem separating out a lot of US philosophical discussions from tech discussions and from corporate discussions. And that's just an example, but it's something that I think certainly when we have tech governance conversations, we get an awful lot of US and often libertarian thinking dropping into that conversation when it shouldn't be. We should be having much better conversations that are more culturally relevant, and we don't always get that.
Yeah. And I just want to say very quickly, in the research I just did, actually, Paul, you touched on what a huge blocker or barrier to entry is for a lot of people in technology and talking about ethics, is that a lot of it gets wrapped up in political conversations, and particularly American political conversations between left and right. And people inherently feel like that's not a space they're knowledgeable and comfortable to be speaking to. And so instead just lean completely out of that conversation. And I think that's something that came up quite a lot in with the technologist I spoke to.
I think something that's interesting about frameworks is that it starts the discussion, and especially when you have frameworks like Sam worked at everyone with consequence scanning, which is just 3 simple questions. When you start with like more open-ended questions, then it invites more people to discuss. So Anne, yesterday you and I were going back on Twitter, as we do, and you talking about something that's the crux of psychological safety as a whole, not just ethics. How do people go about speaking up when something seems off? Because I think we lean on Volkswagen scandal a lot, because the developer who went to jail with the emissions scandal said, But I was just doing what I was told to do, which I think the Nuremberg trials taught us is not an acceptable reasoning, but still, he thought that. How do you deal with that? How do you go about speaking up? How do you balance loyalty and ethics? Or how do you deal with the fact that there's a chance you have an NDA or things like that?
It actually is a very interesting question. And in my course, in my tech ethics course, I basically said, oh, well, you've got to speak up. And, if you've got psychological safety, hooray, you're done and you can. And I got picked up and forced to do an extra lecture by my students, quite correctly, because they said, well, what if we don't work somewhere with psychological safety? And I can go on and say further than that, even if you do, if you're a professional in an awful lot of the industry, certainly when I was an engineer, you're not just in your office making decisions and suggesting things and talking to people about what your products do. You're at your customers. You're at potential customers, you're at suppliers, you are, and you might be as psychologically safe as you like in your own business, but when you go out there, you're not in the same environment, and you have to be careful about what you say. You can't necessarily say everything you want to. And I think there is certainly when I was managing teams of engineers who were doing that, who were having to go out on site and talk to people in areas. I hope that my team was reasonably psychologically safe, but I'm probably kidding myself.
How do you know? Yeah.
Do I know? Exactly. How do I know? But I know that when they went out, that wouldn't be the case, and they knew it wouldn't be the case. And they were all scared. Well, what if something happens? What if somebody asks me something? What if I have to say, give my professional judgment and it wouldn't be necessarily what they wanted to hear? What should I do about that? And the answer is always to step it back, to de-escalate, to take the urgency of it. So everybody, one of the things I got with all my engineers was to have a list of stalling phrases that they would use to get themselves out. I mean, I'm sure almost everybody's read Thinking Fast and Slow at this point. You don't want to let your fast thinking answer your customer questions, because your fast brain is not ethical, it's not contemplative, it's not thinking about the long-term consequences. So you never want to answer a question or commit to a deadline in 10 seconds. You always need to be able to step back and say, well, I need to be thinking about this for a few hours at least. So it was stalling ideas. The most effective thing you ever did at work with this kind of thing was, oh, that's a really interesting question, or that's a really interesting idea. There's an expert back at the office that I'd really like to talk to you about this before I come back with an answer. Is it okay if I come back to you tomorrow? So nobody ever objects to a bit of flattery. Great question, great, that's a great idea. Then, I'm going to go and talk to an expert who's even more expert than me on this. No one ever objects to that. Come back tomorrow. So make sure that you set a short deadline that you do come back on, but it gives you a little bit of time to make sure that you answer the question with your type 2 thinking, your slow thinking, or you actually go back and talk to the expert at the office and then get back to them. You don't, you don't treat it like you're running away from a lion. You treat it like you're a professional.
Or talk to the experts in the screen right now. You have been experimenting with ethics for a long time. So I definitely want to give some off-screen conversation time, because we've got a really active chat going on now too. So I want to wrap up the live stream. So I just want to end on a positive note, starting with Caitlin. How do you stay optimistic? What are you looking forward to in the next 6 months?
I stay optimistic because, and this is something that one of my podcast guests said recently, all right, you look around, there's all this proliferation of everything that's going on. It can feel really overwhelming when you work in this space. But one thing that means is that it's an increasing part of the conversation that's just part of day-to-day business anyway. So it is becoming something that is making its way onto the executive agenda and in fact on everyone's agenda. So that makes me feel really positive.
Okay. Kingsley, what's making you excited this year?
Sure, okay. So I'd say probably the thing to bear in mind is that almost the strongest attribute you can have about being an ethical technologist is the ability to harness your optimism. We're in a very much a supplier's market. If you're working within technology and within digital, you are incredibly valuable. For me, it always feels like a privilege to work within technology, and it feels like you should use that privilege for its best outcome. We are privileged to be working in this. We should be able to use some of that privilege to direct things in an ethical manner. We're empowered. We have the power to do that. So that fills me with optimism going forward.
Great. Sam, I see you nodding along. Same question.
Yeah, I love what Kingsley said. And I'll kind of add to that a little bit. Is I think for me, it's relativism. So I used to do a lot of corporate accountability in the oil, mining, and gas sector. And there is no motivator in that sector other than profit. Whereas in technology, there's whole other host of optimism around how the world in the future, can be better. And I think there's a lot of energy there for exploring these questions and thinking about what it means to be an ethical technologist. And that always keeps me optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's clearly a motivator in hiring when we are privileged in the tech community where there are more people, there are more jobs than people. So it is something that you can hopefully use as a hiring bonus or motivator to get hired. Anne, what keeps you happy and motivated in these trying times?
Well, so Kingsley mentioned the project that Paul and I had been doing about sustainable servers and targets for data centers being more energy efficient. That's made huge progress. Even in the couple of years that we've been working on it, we have actually seen progress. We haven't seen the big tech players get better in their behavior. So, and a lot of that is down to developers saying that they cared and they wanted it to happen. Developers have power, and we are finally starting to use it, and that's starting to pay off. So that's a really good example of say what you want, you might get what you want, and the world will be a better place.
And if not, there's a lot of us on Twitter there to help you find that next one for sure. Paul, round us out. What has you optimistic in the next 6 months?
Well, everyone said an awful lot, and you came to me last, so I'm thankful for everyone else stealing all the things I could have said. Honestly, I've seen a huge amount of growth in the conversations around ethics, and I think we have a huge opportunity to continue to highlight the issues, and I think that those issues are becoming more and more mainstream as things like AI and things like climate become more and more prominent in the conversations that we're having in tech. And I think we have opportunities now to bring those up. I think a few years ago, if we'd have brought these things up, people would have just ignored them. I think now people are aware of those conversations, and I don't think anyone is going to stop a person having those conversations in pretty much any company now.
Hopefully.
I think, yeah, hopefully. But even if they do, I think there is, you have the pushback to be able to go, no, I think we should have a little bit more thought around this. So that's what's making me positive over the next few months, because I think ethics has become significantly more important than it was.
Thank you, everyone, so much. I will be adding a lot of links to resources in this YouTube channel. And thank you, Sam, Anne, Paul, Kingsley, and Caitlin, for this great conversation. Everyone, you have a voice, and I'm not just talking about the 6 of us here. We've honed that habit. Get into the habit of asking more questions.